Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. The morning was so warm that children left for school without their coats. Across the Great Plains, from Montana to Nebraska, from the Dakotas to Minnesota, January 12, 1888, had dawned unseasonably mild. Snow was melting. Farmers worked in their fields without jackets. In one-room schoolhouses scattered across the prairie, teachers let children play outside during the noon recess, enjoying the unexpected gift of a January thaw. By mid-afternoon, many of those children would be dead. What came next would be remembered as the Schoolchildren's blizzard, a storm so sudden, so violent, and so perfectly timed to catch the most vulnerable people in the most exposed places that it would scar the memory of the Great Plains for generations. When it was over, at least 235 people had frozen to death, and by some estimates, more than half of them were children. Picture this. It's just after noon on the Nebraska prairie. The temperature hovers above freezing. Remarkable for January, a 19-year-old schoolteacher named Minnie Freeman watches her students play in the muddy schoolyard outside their small sod schoolhouse. The sun is out. The air is still. Then she notices something on the northwestern horizon. A dark wall stretching across the sky, moving fast, faster than anything she's ever seen. Later, survivors would describe it as looking like a freight train, or a tidal wave, or simply like midnight arriving at noon. Within minutes, that wall of ice and wind slams into the little schoolhouse. The temperature plummets. Snow so fine it's like sifted flour fills the air, making it impossible to see a hand in front of your face. And the wind, gusting to 60 miles per hour, begins tearing the roof off the building. Minnie Freeman has perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether her students live or die. Let me build the clock for you, because what made this storm so deadly wasn't just its ferocity. It was its timing, its speed, and the vulnerability of the people in its path. By 1888, the Great Plains were in the midst of a population boom. Homesteaders had flooded into the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and beyond, drawn by the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. Many were recent immigrants, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, who had never experienced a prairie winter. They built homes of sod because there were no trees. They heated them with hay and cow chips because there was no wood. And they sent their children to one-room schoolhouses, often taught by teenage girls barely older than their oldest pupils. These families knew winter was dangerous, but they'd survived December, and they'd learned to read the signs, or thought they had. A Norwegian immigrant named Carl Salte, living in Fortier, Minnesota, later remembered that on the morning of January 12th, it was so warm it melted snow and ice from the window until after 1 p.m. He had no idea what was coming. What they couldn't know, was that an Arctic air mass was racing south out of Canada at speeds that would make modern meteorologists shake their heads in disbelief. The cold front was self-reinforcing, so powerful it would eventually drop temperatures as far south as Veracruz, Mexico, before finally dissipating. The weather prediction for that day, issued by the U.S. Signal Corps, had called for fair weather followed by colder temperatures. The indications officer in St. Paul, Minnesota, had warned that a cold wave is indicated for Dakota and Nebraska tonight. But the telegraph lines that might have carried updated warnings didn't reach most prairie communities. The forecasters didn't fully understand what was coming, and even if they had, there was no way to warn a farmer's wife hanging laundry or a teacher dismissing students for the afternoon. By mid-morning, the cold front had crossed Montana, catching ranchers doing their early chores. By noon, it was burying the Dakotas, slamming into children at their recess. By early afternoon, it swept into Nebraska just as schools were letting out for the day. Carl Salty watched it arrive, a dark and heavy wall built up around the Northwest coming fast, he wrote, coming like those heavy thunderstorms, like a shot. In a few moments, we had the severest snowstorm I ever saw in my life, with a terrible hard wind. Like a hurricane, snow so thick we could not see more than 3 steps from the door at times. The storm had found its victims exactly where they were most vulnerable, on the open prairie, between home and school, with no shelter in sight. What happened next played out in hundreds of variations across thousands of square miles. And in almost every case, survival came down to decisions made in seconds by people who had no good options. Consider the choice facing those young teachers. When the storm hit, they could keep their students inside, but many schoolhouses were poorly built, running out of coal and literally coming apart in the wind. Or they could try to lead the children to safety, but in a whiteout so complete that people became lost within steps of their own front doors. Minnie Freeman chose to act. When the storm tore the roof off her sod schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska, she gathered her students. Some accounts say she tied them together with twine from her desk and led them through the blinding snow to a farmhouse a quarter-mile away. All of them survived. She became a national hero. A song was written about her. She received more than 80 marriage proposals from men she'd never met. But consider Loie Royce, another teenage teacher in Plainview, Nebraska. When her schoolhouse ran out of fuel, she faced the same impossible choice. Her boarding house was just 75 yards away, close enough to see on any normal day. She gathered her 3 students, 2 9-year-olds and a 6-year-old, and stepped into the storm. They never made it. Royce became disoriented within steps. The children froze to death in the snow. Royce survived, but both of her feet had to be amputated. Same storm, same impossible choice, different outcomes. Across the prairie, the randomness of survival defied logic. A farmer named James Jackson, near Woodstock, Minnesota, discovered his entire cattle herd frozen to death in a 10-mile stretch. A man caught between towns crawled into a barn and survived the night by huddling with pigs. In O'Neill, Nebraska, townspeople rang church bells and blew mill whistles at 1-minute intervals through the night, hoping the sound would guide lost travelers to safety. Some followed the sound and lived. Others never heard it. One farmer, named William Compton, had gone to town to pick up supplies just days after his wife Kate gave birth to their first son. When the storm hit, his friends urged him to stay in town, but he knew Kate was alone with the newborn. He set out into the blizzard. His horses suffocated in the wind, unable to breathe against the driving snow. He found a barn and crawled inside with the pigs to survive the night. It took him 3 days to reach home. Kate had stayed in bed with the baby, keeping warm under the blankets. All 3 survived. Another farmer, caught in the storm with only his wagon and a blind mare, gave up trying to navigate. He loosened the reins and let the horse find her own way. The mare, who had traveled that road dozens of times without ever seeing it, walked straight home. Meanwhile, a newspaper editor in Lake Benton, Minnesota, returned to his office to find the stairway packed solid with snow that had forced its way through the door and filled the building. His bed was covered with several inches of snow that had filtered through his keyhole. How do you explain any of it? Some lived because they made the right choice. Some died despite doing everything right. And some survived through nothing but blind luck, or, in one case, a blind horse. We live now in an age of weather satellites and smartphone alerts, of heated cars and emergency services. It's tempting to think that a disaster like the Schoolchildren's blizzard couldn't happen today. But the underlying questions haven't changed. How do we prepare for events that exceed our experience? How do we communicate warnings to people who need them most? And when disaster strikes faster than anyone can respond, how do we make impossible decisions with inadequate information? Every winter, storms still catch people unprepared. Every year, schools still face decisions about whether to close or stay open, whether to send children home or keep them safe inside. The technology has improved, the fundamental vulnerability hasn't disappeared, and there's something else the Schoolchildren's blizzard reveals. Something about how communities remember trauma. In 1940, more than 50 years after the storm, survivors gathered in Lincoln, Nebraska, and formed the Blizzard of 1888 Club. They collected stories, published a book, and erected historical markers. In 1967, for Nebraska's centennial, a glass mural depicting Minnie Freeman leading her students to safety was installed in the state capitol. The historian David Laskin, who wrote extensively about this storm, observed something striking about its legacy. The physical traces have vanished. No frozen bodies, no ruined schoolhouses, no snow. But in the identity of the region, he wrote, the storm remains as sharply etched as ever. This is a place, Laskin noted, where people still tell their children. Blizzards kill children on their way home from school. The philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal once wrote, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." Pascal was speaking of the cosmos, but his words capture something essential about what happened on January 12, 1888. The prairie, in that moment, became infinite, a white void with no landmarks, no directions, no sound but the roar of the wind. People froze to death within shouting distance of safety, unable to see or hear or find their way. Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about courage or preparation or good intentions. The same storm that killed children walking home from school spared others through sheer chance. Minnie Freeman became a hero. Loie Royce lost her feet and her students. The difference wasn't character, it was luck. That's a difficult truth to sit with. We want to believe that the right choices lead to the right outcomes. The Schoolchildren's blizzard suggests otherwise, and perhaps that's why it has haunted the Great Plains for more than a century. These are the facts. On January 12, 1888, an Arctic cold front swept across the Great Plains with almost no warning. Temperatures dropped as much as 100 degrees in 24 hours. Winds gusted to 60 miles per hour. Visibility fell to zero. At least 235 people died, many of them children caught between school and home. These are also facts. Teenage teachers made split-second decisions that saved lives or ended them. Farmers survived by crawling into barns with livestock. Communities rang bells through the night, hoping to guide the lost to safety. And for generations afterward, survivors gathered to tell their stories, determined that the dead would not be forgotten. And this is the consequence we still live with. In an age of technology, we remain vulnerable to nature's indifference. The warnings are better, the shelters are stronger. But when the sky turns black at noon, the fundamental question hasn't changed. What would you do? I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. What would you have done if you were a 19-year-old teacher with a dozen children in your care, the roof blowing off your schoolhouse, and 75 yards of invisible snow between you and safety? Because that's what the Schoolchildren's Blizzard teaches us. Not just about the power of nature, but about the weight of decisions made when there's no time to think and no good choices to make. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or a comment means more than you might realize. It helps other history lovers find us, and honestly, I read every single one. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who might appreciate it too. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.